Today, the Hebrew language and the state of Israel seem inseparable. But what's crazy is that for millennia, spoken Hebrew was an all but dead language. Sure, the Bible, prayers, and religious texts were written and read in Hebrew, but nobody spoke it in daily life. So how did an almost extinct biblical language become the mother tongue of world Jewry in the span of only a few decades, something that had never happened in the history of language? And what role did a radical linguistic revolutionary named Eliezer Ben Yehuda play in the miraculous rebirth of Hebrew? Let's go back, like way back. In the Bible, the Jews, otherwise known as Hebrews, spoke an ancient, more biblical version of Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew remained the native tongue of Jews for over 1,000 years, but Hebrew as a spoken language began to die out around the year 70. That's the year the Romans destroyed the second Jewish temple in Jerusalem and exiled a vast number of Jewish people from Israel. And Hebrew as a spoken language really kicked the bucket about 65 years later in 135 after the failure of the Bar Kochva revolt, when Roman Emperor Hadrian expelled, enslaved, or killed most of Israel's remaining Jews, the final native Hebrew speakers. So that should have been the end of Hebrew, right? Well, no. Hebrew as a spoken language was dead, but the few Jews left in Israel continued using Hebrew in the study of Torah, but, and this is key, they only used it as a written, literary language. According to Louis Glinner in his book The Story of Hebrew, reading Hebrew became a sort of spiritual resistance by Jews against their Roman oppressors. By the turn of the 2nd century, Aramaic had become the commonly used language of the Middle East, but Hebrew as a written language for Torah study still persisted. And at the turn of the 3rd century, Rabbi Judah the Prince, then the leader of the small remaining Israeli Jewish community, was determined to give written Hebrew an even better shot at survival. He decided that he would exclusively use Hebrew in his editing of the Mishnah, the compilation of Jewish law, and the basis for the Talmud. His very deliberate choice to codify Hebrew as the language of the Mishnah kept written Hebrew alive. But by the 6th century, Hebrew's use for Torah study was very limited. This is when the Talmud, the encyclopedic work forming the basis of all Jewish law, was composed. It was a whopping 5,400 or so pages, in mostly Aramaic. Still though, Hebrew held on. Medieval scholars wrote their commentaries on the Bible and Talmud in Hebrew, from Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, or Rashi, in France, to Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra in Spain. Maimonides, the 12th century leader of the Jewish community in Egypt, wrote his Mishnah Torah, or Code of Law, in Hebrew, covering every detail of Jewish observance. Okay, we've got the ancient and medieval history covered, so it's time to talk about Eliezer Ben Yehuda, who resurrected Hebrew as a spoken language in its modern form, right? Not so fast. The revival of Hebrew as a modern language actually started well before his time, with one period often overlooked. The 18th century saw the Age of Enlightenment, during which the study of language rose in popularity, and Hebrew is no exception. In fact, many Christians obsessed over Hebrew, regarding it as a classical language akin to Latin, as you can see from some of the emblems of Ivy League schools. Some of America's founders were well-versed in Hebrew as well, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton chief among them. In 1783, secular Jewish intellectuals, part of the Jewish Enlightenment movement known as the Haskalah, started a Hebrew language periodical called HaMe'asef. Their goal was to spread the language and demonstrate its beauty. By publishing Hebrew language newspapers distributed to tens of thousands, they furthered a new Hebrew style closely tied to the vernacular and very different from old school rabbinic Hebrew. So while this new Hebrew 2.0 was still mainly literary, it was now used to write about all sorts of mundane things, not just the Bible. Okay, enough about reading and writing Hebrew. When and how did Hebrew actually become a spoken language? Well, in the late 19th century, the Zionist movement began to take shape. And amongst cultural Zionists, as opposed to Theodor Herzl's more political Zionism, Hebrew was a way to return to their ancient Jewish roots. But modern Hebrew still faced some major hurdles. One of them was Yiddish. Yiddish wasn't just the spoken language of most European Jews, it was their mother tongue, their way of life. The Hebrew pioneers themselves didn't start off speaking Hebrew. Imagine these Yiddish speakers struggling to use a language in their daily life that must have sounded terribly formal and stilted. It'd be like trying to order a pizza in Latin. And there were more than a fair share of Zionist leaders who didn't have much faith in the resurrection of Hebrew. Moshe Lilienblum, a pre-Herzl Zionist leader, actually said Hebrew's time was up. Herzl himself even thought German was the natural choice for Zionism. After all, he said, who knows enough Hebrew to buy a train ticket? And of course, there were the Ashkenazi Orthodox Jews, many of them Hasidim, who still held firm in their belief that Hebrew should only be used for holy topics like Torah study and prayer. Even more so, now that modern Hebrew had become associated with secularism and Zionism, things they were not huge fans of. So all in all, the opportunity to revive spoken Hebrew seemed quite slim. And then there's Eliezer Ben Yehuda. Born Eliezer Yitzchak Perelman, he believed the future of the Jews required both their own land and their own language. And Hebrew was the way to unite Jews across the globe. Eliezer's obsession with Hebrew started as a child in Europe, when his yeshiva teacher secretly introduced him to secular Hebrew literature, such as the works of Achad Ha'am, a leader of the cultural Zionist movement we spoke about earlier. Eliezer also discovered that in rare cases, when two Jewish communities that spoke different languages, say Yiddish and Arabic, needed to correspond with each other, they would sometimes use a form of medieval Hebrew as a common language. This strengthened his resolve, and in 1881, he packed his bags and made the trek to Palestine. Adopting the biblical-sounding name Eliezer Ben Yehuda, he and his wife established the world's first strictly speaking Hebrew household in almost 2,000 years, and soon produced the world's first native Hebrew speaker in almost 2,000 years, their son, Ben Sion. Now, it's easy to criticize how Ben Yehuda raised Ben Sion in a home that spoke a language no one else was using, but sometimes it takes a little bit of crazy to create profound change. The experiment got off to a rough start. By the age of 4, Ben Sion still wasn't talking, and Ben Yehuda was so obsessed with proving that Hebrew could exist as a modern daily language, he actually prevented Ben Sion from playing with other kids to avoid any corruption of his Hebrew. Ben Sion later wrote that his father wouldn't let him listen to the chirping of birds or the neighing of horses, since they didn't do it in Hebrew. Maybe an exaggeration, but Ben Yehuda wasn't messing around. Ben Yehuda's friends and colleagues were telling him to give up, but suddenly the kid's first word finally came: Abba, Daddy. Ben Yehuda wrote in his diary that there was now no room for doubt that Hebrew could become the spoken language of a community. But how do you make this change happen? Ben Yehuda believed the key was to use it as the language of instruction in schools. Hebrew wouldn't just be a subject studied, it would be the language used to teach all other subjects like math and history. The first all-Hebrew elementary school was founded in 1899, and within 10 years, the number of all-Hebrew schools grew to 20, with 2,500 students. Ben Yehuda argued that Hebrew would become a living language by moving from the schools into the home, and his work convinced many secular nationalist Jews of the same thing. In 1890, Ben Yehuda founded the Vad HaLashon, or the Language Council, which still exists to this day as the Academy of the Hebrew Language. The council published bulletins and dictionaries, coining thousands of words you don't find in the Torah, like doll, ice cream, and bicycle. Not every word he invented caught on, but Ben Yehuda took it upon himself to keep the language growing. Like we mentioned earlier, Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, initially preferred German to Hebrew as the language for Israel. But he soon reversed his position, even embracing Hebrew while embarrassed that he could not speak it. After his death, the Zionist Congress officially declared Hebrew the language of Zionism. The language spread through schools and homes in Israel and developed through trial and error. But Eliezer Ben Yehuda had achieved his goal. Shortly before Ben Yehuda died in 1922, Britain officially recognized Hebrew as the language of Palestine's Jewish inhabitants. 26 years later, Israel became an official Hebrew-speaking state. But just like the story didn't begin with Ben Yehuda, it certainly doesn't end there either. He became the face of the movement, but there was still a lot of work to be done. While Ben Yehuda invented about 150 words, his son Ben Sion and others came up with thousands more. In fact, the first Hebrew dictionary wasn't completed until 1959, 11 years after Israel was founded. And just think about the fields of medicine, science, and law. Entire dictionaries needed to be written to cover new concepts that hadn't even existed when the Bible was written. Men like Dr. Aaron Meir Mazia took on the task of advising Ben Yehuda during his life and continued his work after his death. By the time of Israel's establishment, over 90% of Israeli kids under 15 were already fluent in Hebrew. With refugees pouring in from all over the world at that time, the need for a common language was front and center. Hebrew was still battling Yiddish as a popular language, but many in Israel's booming immigrant population considered Yiddish a language of exile and a reminder of things they'd rather forget. With the new state founded, Israeli leaders wanted to cement an Israeli identity, and they knew Hebrew was a key ingredient needed to bond them all together. Ben-Gurion went so far as suppressing Yiddish from being used in any public role, using a well-organized political system to force Hebrew usage through its comprehensive services to the immigrant masses. Schools were in Hebrew, youth movements were in Hebrew, compulsory military service was in Hebrew, political leaders Hebraicized their names. David Gruen became David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meyerson became Golda Meir, and thus Hebrew as a language finally won. So it would seem like Eliezer Ben Yehuda was responsible in many ways for reviving and modernizing Hebrew. But it took an entire people over many centuries to ensure that he would be able to accomplish this feat. So while we usually credit Ben Yehuda with single-handedly bringing Hebrew back to life, It's really more complicated than that. As Zionist leader Menachem Usishkin later said of Ben Yehuda, the people needed a hero, so we gave them one. Still, it was Ben Yehuda who steered the language past the array of obstacles facing it in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Remember, not everyone wanted it to succeed. If Herzl had his way initially, Israelis would be speaking German. Doesn't sound right, does it? So, can your average American teenager read and understand a 300-year-old English manuscript without help? Unlikely. But any Hebrew speaker can open up a 3,000-year-old Hebrew text and make sense of it, religious or not. Hebrew's rebirth returned a common language to an ancient people, and its revival also helped lead to the miracle of Israel's rebirth. Jews now have both a land and a language, just as Ben Yehuda envisioned. Thanks for watching. See you guys next week.